picture demonstration. Yesterday we had a hip case and we discussed so many points there, and today. So what I'm going to talk here is nothing new. I'm not going to talk about something different from what you have learned as the methodology of examining the hip. My duty here is to emphasize on certain points so that when you are presenting the hip case after examination, your presentation becomes it is fluent, it is seamless, and it avoids the repetition. Well, at the to have a little insight into the methodology of hip joint involvement, you must understand right in the beginning that it is the unilateral hip involvement which is predominantly addressed by the methodology which we have learned. And this methodology is heavily dependent on comparison with the normal side. We have the affected side and we have the normal side. So it is heavily dependent on the comparison with normal side. You need an adequate exposure to embark upon hip joint examination, and I had told you certain points yesterday, I won't repeat it, but a male patient should be in an underwear, his entire torso and legs should be exposed, because another area of understanding is that when we talk about hip joint examination, in fact, we are considering the entire spine, hip, knee complex, because any deviation or any deformity in the hip has the capability of being corrected either at the spine level or at the knee level or both. So you need to have a good exposure of all these parts. If you have a female patient, then the female should be obviously in an underwear and in a brassiere, but never undress a female patient unless you have a staff nurse, a lady nurse available with you, or a female relative. This is, I think it needs no further emphasis, because it is unethical, and if the examiner sees you that you have embarked upon a female examination without a female attendant, it goes against you. Well, what I'm going to emphasize here is the candidate yesterday examined the case, presented it. But what I want you to incorporate in everyday hip joint examination is a sequence of examination. And the sequence that I recommend is based on scientific principles. Imagine yourself sitting in an OPD and a patient comes to you for examination. The first thing that you notice in this patient is the gait. As he walks from the gate, from the entrance door to your examination chair or the stool which has been provided for him. So the sequence is walking, standing, sitting, squatting, sitting cross-legged, and lying down. Finally is lying down. So if you examine your patient in this sequence, the first thing which is going to happen is there is minimal discomfort to the patient, because every time you make the patient stand or lie down, these patients usually have a painful hip pathology and they are in a lot of pain. And if you look at this sequence, one thing is leading to another and there is minimal discomfort. Majority of the hip joint examination is performed in the lying down position, and that too in the supine position. So this sequence, if you incorporate in your day-to-day examination of the hip joint, it will also ensure that there is minimal repetition. So we start with the patient walking. The first thing that you notice is you have to classify the gait of this patient, and we all know that there are three types of pure gaits which can be seen in hip joint pathology. the antalgic, the short limb, and the Trendelenburg gait. But you must not go away with the idea that you have to classify them into these pure forms, because it is but natural to find patients who have a combination of these two. Yesterday also we had a patient who had a combination of short limb with a Trendelenburg gait. And for your information, the Trendelenburg component in that patient was not picked up by the examinee because of the simple reason that it is a well-known fact that in presence of shortening, the Trendelenburg component becomes less pronounced, or it becomes masked. And the corollary to this is, if you have a patient who has a Trendelenburg test positive, walks with a Trendelenburg gait and has shortening, you will never compensate this shortening to its entire amount. So always leave 2 centimeters of the shortening undercorrected if you are giving a shoelace to these patients. So what I am trying to emphasize is, the patient may have a short limb gait, along with that an antalgic component. So your duty is to bring out the various components in the gait of that particular patient. So the dictum is that you allow the patient to first come towards you and then go away from you, and allow or ask him to walk for about 15 to 20 steps each time. And if you are not able to make out the gait in the first instance, there is no harm in having a repetition of the entire cycle. So in this particular patient, if you have observed, this patient is walking with an equinus. There is an equinus. That means that he is probably compensating for some shortening. And look at the furrow which is appearing here in the trunk, which is reflecting that there is a Trendelenburg component. There is a swaying of the trunk away from the midline on the affected side. So you can have a look at that. I think it's pretty clear now. After you have examined the patient in the walking stage, you ask the patient to just stand, and standing examination can be done from the front, the side, and from behind. From the front, now in the standing position, we have included only those points which either cannot be performed in the lying down position, or those points or those points which are likely to change. If you make the patient lie down, there may be a change. So from the front, the most important is the level of the anterior superior iliac spine, what has happened to the affected side in comparison to the normal side, because this is likely to change. If the patient has a lower anterior superior iliac spine in standing, right? We saw in the yesterday's patient, his anterior superior iliac spine was at a lower level. But when we made him lie down, I had demonstrated to you that there we could bring that anterior superior iliac spine to the same level, for the simple reason that this patient had this deflection purely because of a limb length discrepancy. From the side, whether there is an exaggerated lordosis, and then you go behind the patient and you try to look for any scoliotic deformity. This scoliotic deformity, again, we said spine, hip, knee complex. So if there is a limb length discrepancy and the anterior superior iliac spine is at a lower level, obviously there will be some compensation occurring at the spine level also, which will be detected as a scoliotic or a coronal plane deformity. Obviously, this is not a structural scoliosis, so it is likely to get corrected the moment the patient either sits or he lies down. And last but not the least, Trendelenburg sign is one sign which all of you know that it cannot be performed in any other position apart from the standing position. So this is the same patient. The observations which you can make with the patient in the standing position. So this patient was standing with a compensatory or an equinus deformity of the angle, and when we saw this patient from the side, we could see that there is a exaggerated lumbar lordosis, and there was a flexed attitude of the affected side knee, and this probably reflects that a combination of equinus here and deflection here has created adequate limb length correction, because the lumbar spine was straight, there was no scoliotic deformity. So if you ask the patient to put the foot flat on the ground, probably the scoliotic deformity will come up. So this is how this patient was compensating for probably limb length discrepancy. And to be able to comment on the level of the anterior superior iliac spine, it is needless to say that your eye level should be at the same level as the anterior superior iliac spine, and this is how you should be in the kneeling position to be able to comment correctly about this indicator. Similarly, if you are performing the Trendelenburg sign, you need to be sitting behind the patient, and the eye level should be more or less at the level of the gluteal fold to make a very correct observation of what is happening to it. So, to give you an idea of the Trendelenburg sign, we demonstrated yesterday also, but to recapitulate, the patient is first asked to stand on the normal side. The gluteal fold on the affected side would rise up. It will go proximal. And followed by this, there is a phase of double stance, when the patient bears weight on both the lower limbs, and finally he is asked to bear weight on the affected side. And when he bears weight on the affected side, this particular patient, the gluteal fold sag down like we had the patient yesterday, and this is what is known as Trendelenburg sign positive. And to give you a video demonstration of the same patient standing on the normal side, the gluteal fold is rising up, followed by double stance, and finally on the affected side, the gluteal fold sags down. So this is the demonstration of the Trendelenburg sign. Once the standing examination is complete, you ask the patient to sit in a chair or on the couch, and you try to assess whether both the anterior superior iliac spines are now in the same horizontal plane or not. If the discrepancy comes, the inference is that there is no compensation occurring at the spine, and this is classified as a fixed pelvic obliquity, typically seen in patients with ankylosing spondylitis, where the spine is also fused and no compensation can occur there. After sitting in a chair, make the patient squat like we did last evening, and majority of the Indian patients, because they are coming from low socioeconomic status, they would have some sort of an adaptation to squat. The Indian patient, because he wants to defecate in that position, so squatting, whether he's able to squat or not, and finally whether he's able to sit cross-legged or not. So these two positions give us a very good functional evaluation, very good functional assessment of the patient, because the cross-leg sitting is important to the Indian patient, it being the position for eating food or the prayer position. So this particular patient was no doubt able to squat, but he had an adaptation. He has adopted a sort of a tripod stance while squatting. He has developed a contact with the knee has got another contact with the floor, and which is allowing him to be stable in the squatting position. It is not the normal squatting position, but this is the adaptation, and this should be underscored. This patient was not able to sit cross-legged, so we have not taken a picture of him. As I said, this is now the stage when you can ask the patient to lie down on the couch, and again, we talked yesterday also that we follow the same principles, inspection, palpation, and so on. But here we usually talk about, in orthopedics, look, feel, and move. look, feel, move and measure if you want the complete sequence. In inspection, again my advice to you is follow a sequence, and the sequence which I recommend is proximal to distal. So if you go proximal to distal, you do not miss out anything. And when you move from proximal to distal on inspection, the first thing which you have to tell us is whether there is an exaggerated lumbar lordosis or not. What is the position of the affected side, anterior superior iliac spine, in comparison to the normal side? Is there any swelling in the region of the hip? Any scars, sinuses, healed or active? Is there any wasting in the thigh? So you're moving from above downwards in a sequence and nothing gets missed out. Because majority of these patients will be having a wasting of the thigh muscles. What is the position of the patella? Yesterday the candidate used the position of the patella for underscoring the limb length discrepancy. I think it is wise to use the patella only as an indicator of rotational attitude or deformity, because we have the median malleolus to give you an idea of whether there is a limb length discrepancy or not. Yes, if there is some distortion there, then you want to use patella in an isolated case, it may be okay, but predominantly patella is an indicator of rotational alignment. And this is what I was suggesting yesterday: examination couch, hard bed, and just a sheet, double sheet on that. And if you can see the screen on the other side through this tunnel which has been created by the lumbar lordosis, then we call it, on inspection, lumbar lordosis is exaggerated. If there are any scars, make a note of them. And in this particular patient, we had a triangular scar just superior to or proximal to the trochanteric area. So this is a scar which is known as an area scar. We have linear scars which have healed by primary intention, but any scar which is broadened, the terminology is area scar. So this is an area scar, and the scar itself tells you the story that probably this is an infected pathology, because the scar has healed by secondary intention. The best position for you to comment on the position of the patella is stand at the foot end of the patient, foot end of the bed, and from here, because from the foot end only this picture has been taken, and you can clearly make out that the affected side patella is in more external rotation than the normal side. Even the normal side, there is a attitude of external rotation of the patella by about 5 to 10 degrees, but on the affected side it is more. And the level of the median malleolus is proximally placed in comparison to the normal side, signifies limb length discrepancy. Do not fall into the trap. Some of us are in the habit of asking you, is this reflective of true shortening or apparent shortening? So since this is only the stage of inspection, no measurements are being talked about, you can say at this stage, no comments can be made on this. It only tells us that this limb is shorter than the other side. Palpation. So as far as palpation is concerned, it is the same sequence to be followed, proximal to distal, and we just keep on confirming our findings of inspection. So is there an exaggerated lumbar lordosis? What is the level of the anterior superior iliac spine? Here there is now a change that as you approach the local area of the hip, the first thing to be commented upon, as you have already been taught, is the local temperature. Always compare with the normal side. With the back of the hand, you feel for the temperature whether it is elevated or not. Is there any anterior hip joint tenderness? So the point which is usually recommended is you feel for femoral artery pulsations which correspond to the mid-inguinal point. Go 2 centimeters distal and lateral. 2 centimeters distal and lateral to this, and with the thumb pressure, you try to see whether tenderness is positive by looking at the face of the patient. If he winces, tenderness is positive. Again, you can use comparative, the same amount of pressure on the normal side, see whether he winces or not. And this point, 2 centimeters distal and lateral, is chosen because if you look at the hip joint, the head of the femur is deeply seated into the acetabulum, and there is no way that you can palpate the head. So this point corresponds to the extra acetabular part of the head of the femur, not the neck of the femur, because there may be a medial migration there. So that is why this point has been selected to look for tenderness. Then we have another maneuver called bitrochanteric compression test, where you put your hands on both the trochanters sideways and give a compression sort of do a compression maneuver. And if the patient winces, then this is indirect evidence that the hip joint is tender. Comment on these swellings, scars and sinuses. If there is a scar or a sinus, try to elicit mobility. Try to see whether on squeezing there is a discharge. And if there is fixity to the underlying structures, then you can be very sure that you are dealing with an infective pathology of the hip. We have also listed the trochanteric palpation here, and the first and the foremost point to be underscored is the tip of the trochanter migrated proximally. And we talked about the 3-digit palpation yesterday. I will not dwell on it further today. You all know about it. And to look for thickening or broadening of the trochanter, you can use the hand as a vernier caliper to make out, and again it is a comparative evaluation. We'll show you in one of the slides how it is done. So this is on palpation. If you can insinuate your hand under the lumbar lordosis, beyond the level of the midline, then it is an exaggerated lumbar lordosis. This is how you arrive at marking the anterior superior iliac spine. You go along from the pubic tubercle, go along the inguinal ligament, and the first bony point which you encounter is the anterior superior iliac spine. Always mark it with a permanent marker. Yesterday we did find that the candidate had not marked certain areas, like he had not bothered to look for the while he made a comment that there is an abduction deformity, he did not mark the Kothari's angle. So whatever you do on the patient, it should leave a permanent mark so that the examiner has no doubt that you have done an examination threadbare. So this is how we leave a mark on the anterior superior iliac spine. This is the 3-digit palpation which we have already talked about yesterday. Thumb at the anterior superior iliac spine, middle finger is on the tip of the greater trochanter, and the index finger is along the vertical line or a perpendicular drawn from the ASIS to the examination couch, and the distance between the index and the middle finger is compared simultaneously with the normal size. So if this distance is decreased on the affected side, obviously the tip of the trochanter is migrated proximally. And this is the vernier caliper like maneuver being performed by the hand of the examinee to be able to assess the anterior-posterior dimension of the greater trochanter. Well, once at this stage of palpation, we can now go on to define what are the deformities in the hip. And for your information, we need to define deformities in 3 planes: the sagittal, the coronal, and the rotational planes. In the sagittal plane, you have to tell us whether there is a fixed flexion deformity. In the coronal, there may be an adduction or the abduction deformity, and the methodology is either the Perkins method, which involves squaring of the pelvis, and the Kothari's angle, which does not demand squaring of the pelvis. You just have to place the 2 lower limbs parallel to each other and draw the Kothari's angle. Rotational deformity, we have already discussed. The patella is a good indicator. And this is how the Thomas's test is performed. We discussed yesterday, place your hand under the exaggerated lumbar lordosis and you flex the thigh and the knee on the unaffected side, on the normal side, till a point when your hand becomes caught between the lumbar lordosis, lumbar spine and the couch. Withdraw the hand, flex the thigh more, and to the extent that you can no longer insinuate a hand. And at that point, if you take this angle, the angle between the axis of the thigh and the couch, this is the angle of fixed flexion deformity, which is about 40-45 degrees in this particular patient. And Perkins' method of measuring the abduction or adduction deformity, in this particular patient, we had to abduct the affected thigh to about 30 degrees from the midline to square the pelvis. So this becomes the angle between the midline and the angle between the axis of the thigh is the angle of fixed abduction deformity. And this is the Kothari's angle which we have been talking about. So there are two reference lines which have to be drawn with both the lower limbs parallel to each other. The first one is the mid reference line from the umbilicus or the xiphisternum to the pubic symphysis. The second reference line is that you just simply connect the two anterior superior iliac spine by a horizontal line. And then from the normal side anterior superior iliac spine, from the normal side anterior superior iliac spine, you drop a perpendicular to the mid reference line. The angle formed between the horizontal line connecting the two anterior superior iliac spine and the perpendicular drawn is the angle or the Kothari's angle of abduction or adduction deformity. The catch here is, please remember, you have to drop the perpendicular according to Kothari from the normal side anterior superior iliac spine. The stage is now set for assessing movements in the hip joint because you have already defined the extent of deformity. So as far as the sagittal plane movements are concerned, that means flexion or extension, after delineating the amount of flexion deformity like we demonstrated yesterday, you can do some further flexion to see what is the arc of motion. So if a patient has 30 degrees of fixed flexion deformity and further 100 degrees of movement is possible, so you will say the flexion movement is, range of motion is from 30 degrees to 100 degrees. And we talked about axis deviation yesterday. So if your patient has more than 90 degrees of hip joint mobility, you should comment on whether there is an axis deviation or not. As far as the coronal plane mobility is concerned, again the same principle. You first reveal the adduction or abduction deformity and then see whether further movement is possible in the same direction as the deformity. So if you have adduction deformity of 10 degrees, is there any further adduction possible? Because it is unscientific to talk about the opposite movement. So if a patient has an adduction deformity, we never comment upon the movement of abduction. This should be very clear to you. And same is the principle for rotation. You first identify the amount of rotational deformity and then try to see that further rotation in the direction of deformity is possible or not. Telescoping we have discussed yesterday is once we have defined normal mobility, we look for abnormal mobility or is to see whether the hip is stable or unstable, and you give longitudinal push and pull to the thigh and see whether there is any telescoping movement. Dassault sign also we have discussed. We will not further devote time to this. As far as range of flexion is concerned, in this particular patient, the Thomas's test was performed to reveal the amount of fixed flexion deformity, which was about 40-45 degrees, and After this, the examinee is now placing the left hand onto the anterior superior iliac spine. And with the other hand, he is trying to flex gently the thigh to define what is the amount of movement which is possible. But in this patient, about 45 degrees, 80 degrees of movement was possible. So since it is not beyond 90 degrees, no need to comment on axis deviation. And this is how we look for rotational movement. You can flex the hip to 90 degrees and use the leg as a lever arm to perform external rotation and internal rotation. So this becomes the amount of rotational arc of movement which is there. And needless to say, you need to perform movements in the extended hip as well as with the hip flex, because in some situations you have a differential restriction of mobility, and this is typically seen in those patients in which there is loss of sphericity of the head of the femur. Cases like Perthes disease of the hip or avascular necrosis of the hip are prone to demonstrate differential movements. Telescoping we have already talked about. This is the maneuver, and now the stage is of measurements. So you all know that there are, I think we can take the questions at the end if you don't mind. We need to have two types of measurements: the apparent, which is taken from the xiphisternum to the medial malleolus, limbs lying parallel to each other, and true measurements taken from anterior superior iliac spine to the medial malleolus. And the prerequisites here are the pelvis should be square, and while measuring the normal side limb, you should place that limb in the same position, identical position, as was required of the affected side limb to square the pelvis. So if these two prerequisites are a must to be satisfied as far as true measurements are concerned. So xiphisternum to medial malleolus, this is apparent measurement being taken, limbs parallel to each other. And this is the true measurement being taken from the anterior superior iliac spine to the medial joint line. This is the affected side, and while with the pelvis square, the two ASIS are at the same horizontal line. And while measuring the normal side, the candidate has abducted the normal side to the same amount as was required of the affected side to square the pelvis. So these two are important points to be remembered when you are measuring true length. And once you have found out the discrepancy between the two limbs, we want to know whether the shortening which you have discovered is supratrochanteric or it is infratrochanteric or both. So for that we have the gold standard is the Bryant's triangle, which gives you a quantitative measurement of the amount of shortening. Again, it is heavily dependent on comparison with the normal side. So if you have a bilateral hip pathology, Bryant's triangle is highly constrained to give you the accurate measurement or the accurate amount of limb length discrepancy. However, there is another parameter called the shoemaker's line. We discussed it yesterday. We will not go into the details of it, but shoemaker's line is likely to be more accurate or more informative, and it will tell you that there is a bilateral supratrochanteric shortening. Both the tips of the greater trochanter, they fall short. They are proximally placed to the Nellton's line. It tells you that there is a bilateral supratrochanteric shortening. And last but not the least, as far as measurements are concerned, the candidate did measure the thigh yesterday, and the only advice is that you should do these measurements in the bulky part of the thigh, which is about the middle 1/3. Do not do it in the distal thigh too far distally, and you need to take an identical point for circumferential measurement from a bony landmark. Either you take the anterior superior iliac spine as the bony landmark, or maybe the proximal pole of patella, and you at a point equidistant from this you take the measurements circumferential measurements on both the normal as well as the abnormal side. And this is the Bryant's triangle which has been drawn in the patient which we are demonstrating, and I have put the normal side and the affected side in one slide for comparison. So this is the normal side, anterior superior iliac spine, tip of the greater trochanter, and we drop a line which is perpendicular to the couch. So this distance, this is known as the base of the Bryant's triangle. The base of the Bryant's triangle is compared with the affected side. So on the affected side, what we find is the triangle is reversed. Like the candidate was talking yesterday also, there was a reversal of the triangle, signifying that there was a significant amount of supratrochanteric shortening. So the point to be underscored is it is comparative analysis, and you must be careful while there are some questions which keep on being asked by candidates when we are drawing the Bryant's triangle or using Bryant's triangle as a quantitative assessment of supratrochanteric shortening. Should we square the pelvis or not? So my advice to you is go by the basic guidelines, and the basic guideline is for any true measurement the pelvis has to be square. So if you stick to the basics, nothing is going to happen. Well, friends, the supine examination is complete now, so it is time for you to turn the patient on the side, and on the side, with the patient on the side, you have to draw the inheritance line. And last but not the least, you see in previous era, majority of the hip joint cases were tubercular hips, and the tuberculosis of the hip has the capability of creating an abscess in the rectovesical pouch. So the per-rectal examination was a routine part of the hip joint examination. I have included here just for the sake of completion and for your knowledge that this sort of a assessment can be done in those cases where you are suspecting a frag infection and you are suspecting a cold abscess to be there. But this is for your knowledge. If you do not do it, you can tell that the patient was not willing, or whatever story you want to tell the examiner. So this is the inheritance line from the anterior superior iliac spine to the most prominent part of the ischial tuberosity. Well, as a student of orthopedics, in my postgraduate days, I think the most difficult part was to try and palpate the most prominent part of the ischial tuberosity. If you look at the anatomical ischial tuberosity, it is a broad area. It's not a tip like the tip of the anterior superior iliac spine. So there is a difficulty, and the difficulty is compounded because we have very bulky gluteal muscles which are there. So just a tip which I want to share with you is that if you palpate the proximal most limit of the ischial tuberosity and the distal most limit of the ischial tuberosity, and you settle for the midpoint there, you are more likely to be accurate in assessment of the most prominent part of the ischial tuberosity. So this is just a tip which I am giving you. Try it in your practice sessions, and if you find that it is helping you, you can use it. It's not in books. Don't quote me anywhere. It's a sort of a personal experience that I am sharing with you. I am not an authority on hip joint, and if you quote me, the examiner may have some disturbed relationship with me, which I don't want it should affect your evaluation in the exam. Okay? So it is now time to make the patient prone. That's the last part of the examination, and in the prone position, I usually suggest that the candidate can combine inspection and palpation together, because very little is to be described here. And the first thing which you notice is there a gluteal wasting or not? And the second thing, you palpate with the flat of the hand and try to look for any abnormal bony mass. which is palpable beyond a depression proximal to the tip of the greater trochanter, and if it is there, then you can infer that it is probably the head of the femur which is dislocated, and if it moves with the movements of the thigh, then you are more or less sure that it is the dislocated head of the femur. And this is in the same patient, when we made him lie prone, there was an obvious gluteus wasting, and we had some healed sinus tracts which were there, and there was a scar, transverse scar, which was a primarily healed scar. But there is enough evidence due to this puckered scar here that we are dealing with an infective pathology. These are telltale signs. And on palpation with the flat of the hand, we could not feel a bony mass, but this is how it is done, and you flex the knee, use the leg as a lever arm to rotate, and to detect any mobility with the flat of the hand. I think we have come to the end of the hip joint examination, and I hope in your day-to-day examination of the hip, this will help you. If there are any questions, we can take them. Yes, please. Special test. Telescoping is a special test. Straight leg raising, if you are thinking that your patient is one which qualifies to be an ununited fracture of the neck of the femur, or you are trying to rule it out, then you can use the active straight leg raising test also as a special test. Does it answer your question, or you want? There are some iliotibial band contraction. You see, we are talking here about intra-articular pathology of the hip. Okay. Iliotibial band contraction, are you suggesting a poliomyelitic hip? I don't think so.
Then it is important to this primary hip pathology which we are discussing. So it's not necessary, because out of the way, as we were discussing yesterday, a test which is not at all required, and to start talking of something entirely out of context. Nobody will mind if you don't do a iliotibial band contraction test in the case of the pathology. There are so many other tests which cannot be mentioned. Crane's test, Ellis test, foot thigh angle, there are so many things. But it is not necessary, it is depending on the case on hand. Otherwise, there can be a number of tests. So he has abbreviated, particularly focused to a hip pathology, particularly related to the hip joint examination.
Sir, how will you do measurements in bilateral?
Who is talking? I don't know. So the person should stand up. The correct thing would be to identify yourself and from where you are, so that we can relate.
I will do measurements in bilateral case.
You see, I have already right in the beginning underscored that this methodology which we are talking is on the premise that you are dealing with a unilateral hip pathology. Bilateral hip pathology is a totally different ballgame. And since these measurements are comparative, it is clinically it is difficult to find out what was the actual length of that particular limb if you have a bilateral hip pathology. Yes, there may be some radiological parameters like scanograms and all, which can give you that there is a coxa-vara or whatever is there, they can reveal the amount of shortening. But clinically, at least I am not aware of any methodology to tell you what was the previous length of this particular limb before it got diseased. All right? Somebody from behind.
So you said the salt sign, it subtends an arc. So what is the arc actually?
So it doesn't subtend an arc. You see, this is the neck of the femur, this is the head of the femur, this is the shaft of the femur. Now, so there is if this thing has to move when I rotate, this will have to move. This is the radius, okay? So the movement will be, with the neck intact, the movement will be like this. So this is the arc which it is subtending. Okay, so the excursion is the excursion of the head or the trochanter. Sorry, imagine this is the trochanter. So the excursion of the trochanter is along the arc of a circle. It moves like this. But if the neck is gone, then you have a situation where the thigh is now rotating on the axis of the thigh. So that wide excursion is no longer there. And you have to compare it with the normal side. So if you compare, you will find the difference. And you start doing it now. Because if you are thinking that with this theoretical knowledge I will be able to pick up Dassault sign on the day of the examination, you are highly mistaken. You have to practice all this in your day-to-day activity. And the entire sequence you should do.
For the lateral line, the flexion is not possible. So can you comment on that?
You see, please sit down. The ideal recommendation or the recommendation is that the hip should be in 90 degrees. But if the hip is, supposing you cannot flex the hip beyond 10 degrees, 20 degrees, I think you can easily say, when the examiner asks you, what about the inheritance line? So you can say that it is, since there is very little flexion possible, I do not expect the inheritance line to give me accurate assessment. But I have drawn the inheritance line. The problem starts when you ask the patient, ask the candidate, where is the inheritance line? Sir, I have not drawn because it was not flexing to 90 degrees. And there are candidates who are so casual or so aggressive in the exam. Sir, it is only 80 degrees of flexion, sir. I have not drawn. It's 80 degrees, sir. So to avoid this sort of a confrontation, my advice to you is you make the best effort. You draw the line, inheritance line. So at least the examiner knows that this candidate, he knows how it is to be performed. He has performed it on the patient and he knows that this is likely to be fallacious because of these reasons. Because the prerequisites are not being satisfied. Okay? You see, yesterday I demonstrated to you that your perception can be wrong. All of us are human beings. So there was a candidate who told us, I'm not blaming him. Not blaming him. It's a learning process for all of us. But I'm trying to take that as a case point that the candidate said, there is an abduction deformity of 30 degrees, so sir, I have not done the Trendelenburg sign. Now what happened was, he was proved wrong on that score. There was no deformity. There was good amount of coronal plane movement possible. So he is wrong on that and he has not done the other test. So it is a compounding effect, cascading effect. Things are going, the downslide has started. Downslide has become more severe. This is what I say, do everything which is possible. Yes, this patient, if he can't stand, you can't force him to stand. But if he can stand for 30 seconds on that limb, perform the Trendelenburg test. Try to make an assessment. Is it positive, negative? Try your best and then try to analyze the data. The problem starts when you, in the light of one data, you avoid the other data or you manipulate the other data. That should not happen. Data collection should be in pure form and then you analyze and then you solve the problem. Okay?
Good morning, sir. Sir, if there is a case with bilateral hip affection and
you see, whatever questions you are asking are theoretical questions. The best thing is a case-oriented questioning. Okay, so in this patient, How is this done? We don't have the case, so there are limitations. So please bear with me on that if I am not able to satisfy you. Yes.
Sir, so if the history mentions that there is a bilateral hip affection,
Yeah.
and when we are explaining the examination for that patient, so directly from our starting of the examination, should we eliminate all the tests and the signs, or should we first attempt something and then say that, sir, these particular things could not be done because of the bilateral hip affection?
Right in the beginning, you should bring out this point that, sir, this patient is having a bilateral hip affliction, and there are certain difficulties which I have encountered, which during my presentation I will highlight. So that gives a good impression on the examiner that yes, whatever, there are bound to be some constraints there.
And sir, for flexion deformity in a bilateral hip case, sir, what is the ideal method of performing a modified Thomas test, sir?
Modified Thomas test. You see, for a bilateral hip pathology for fixed flexion deformity, there are two things that you can do. One is that you can do a bilateral Thomas's test. A bilateral Thomas's test. Okay? Provided there is some movement possible, isn't it? You need to have a mobile hip for that. So you try to flex the hip on both sides and try to see what is the angle of fixed flexion deformity on the other side. Or you can perform the prone. Place the patient in the prone position, supported right up in here. The hips are hanging out of the couch, and then one by one you place your hand on the lumbar spine, and when you extend the hip, you try to see for reappearance of the lumbar lordosis, and you stop at that stage. So you can perform one by one on each side. I think these are two methods which can bail you out in such a situation.
Sir.
But remember, in its pure form, Thomas's test is Thomas's well-legged flexion test. If you do not have a well-legged, then Thomas's test in its pure form is not being performed. Okay?
Sir, and regarding the length measurements, do we have to say that it is a true length and apparent length in cases of bilateral case?
I talked about unilateral,
So just
and you are questioning me on bilateral. See, my advice to you is, if there is a case, then whatever difficulty is being encountered, we can talk about it. But to give you an answer, since there is bound to be a bilateral limb length discrepancy, you see, unless you have a comparison, how can you say that there is bilateral? The only indicator would be the Nellton's line. The only indicator is the Nellton's line, which tells you there is a bilateral supratrochanteric shock. But otherwise, it's difficult because you have to take one limb as the reference limb. All right?
So during the viva, when the viva is going on, what word we should use? Like it's we have measured the true length is this, apparent length is this. We have to eliminate all that in the viva, sir.
See, it all depends on the case. To give an example, ankylosing spondylitis is one disease which gives you a bilateral hip involvement, isn't it? Now, in this given stage, what is the status of the patient as a whole? Is this or not? It will have a lot of relevance to all these things. So, in a given case, you have to analyze that. Theoretically, we can't just get into all this. Okay? No, fixed reduction, how much? Yes. So you will adduct the affected limb to square the pelvis.
So how to take group measurement? There are problems in that. One limb is on the couch and other is from side. There is a discrepancy in the measurement.
One limb will have to be placed over the other, isn't it? So you want to say that just by placing it here, the length will change? The length will change?
Difficult measuring to the lower lip, the one.
You see, these problems are bound to be there, and as I said, these are clinical measurements. These are clinical measurements, and the difference is. उसको नीचे करके देख लो, फिर ऊपर करके देख लो कितना फर्क आ रहा है, ठीक है, और फिर बीच का ले लो.
You can take an average of two. Yes.
See, we are very good. All Indians are very good at jugaad, isn't it? This is all jugaad. This is all theory. You are pushing a theoretical question to me, and I am giving a sort of a answer just to get rid of the situation. But my advice to you is actual case should be done, so that we can solve that problem. We can actually see what is happening. All right? Because you can't do this, because you can tell the examiner that this is because of the crossing of the limbs. There is likely to be some error because it's clinical measurement. But these are my measurements. The examiner at the best can put the tape and see whether your measurement is correct. That's the end of it. If there is a technical difficulty, it will be there for you also, for me also. Okay?
Sir, I'm from Mumbai, and
I think the questions will never end, and my friend here is bailing me out, and he says that I have to leave because the chief guest is there, and ordinary people have no place here.
You can take the question during the case.
Excuse me. Sir, can you just answer my last? Just a small one.
Yeah. While I'm moving away, I try to.
We have attended many clinics in Mumbai, and
Is obliterated, and you continue flexing the hip, the pelvis will start rotating, and it will give you an erroneously high area. That is my concern. Now, whether the buttock rises at that stage or not, I don't know. If the gluteal wasting is tremendous, it will start appearing even beforehand. All right?
And so second thing is when we completely flex the unaffected limb and lumbar lordosis is completely obliterated, then some people say that we have to extend the affected limb in order to get the normal lumbar lordosis curvature, so that we can find the normal thing. But while you was explaining, it was like we have to completely obliterate it, and no, we don't need to get the normal
My
curvature.
advice to you is, we are very fond of saying some people want this, some people want this. My advice to you is, read the Thomas's original article. Okay? At least we should know what he wanted. Okay? जिसका नाम सदियों से लिए जा रहे हैं और माला पहनाए जा रहे हैं उसका तो हमें पता ही नहीं वो क्या कहा गया है. Okay? These are all individual modifications in an attempt to see that the correct evaluation is being made. Okay, but you should first know what is the exact wordings of Thomas regarding this question. Okay? There is no harm if you give a straight tab, but when you are giving that straight tab, it should not make these number lordosis reappear.
Normal format.
Yeah, see, if I push it high, the number lordosis will reappear. Okay? On the other hand, if the patient, due to some involuntary movement or muscle spasm, he has overflexed, then a little jab will correct that. So it all depends on what we are trying to do. We should know what is the science behind it. What is the science behind it?